Welcome back to Previously Prohibited. This is episode 5, and we're going to start part 1 talking about the Tik Tok case, which is going to be heard in the Supreme Court on January 10th. And then part 2 will be about the controversy over H-1B visas and India's role in all of that, which has lit the Twitter world aflame. I'm Jenin. I'm here with my co-host Mel, just
Hi,
a couple of
guys.
days after Christmas. And go ahead, Mel.
Yeah, so real quick, if you guys could, if you're watching this, whatever you're watching on, if you could like and subscribe, that really helps us in the algorithm. It really helps to boost our content, and we would so appreciate it. So whether you're on YouTube, Rumble, Spotify, Substack, we're going to get up on there today. So we definitely appreciate all of your shares and everything like that. It's been so awesome to get the feedback from you guys. So without further ado,
we have a Twitter account too, right?
Yep,
Previously Prohibited.
It's not the full previous. It's just PREV. There's a character limit on the
right.
but pre
follow us
prohibited.
there too.
Yeah, we would appreciate it definitely.
So the Tik Tok case is a very interesting case. I would say it's probably one of the most important First Amendment cases in quite some time, other than my First Amendment case that reached the Supreme Court in June. It was heard in March, decided in June adversely. I'm kind of kidding, but they were both two of the seminal cases, I would say. This one raises a very interesting issue, which is whether Congress can entirely ban a social media platform, ostensibly on the grounds that it creates a national security risk. So basically what happened was earlier this year, Congress passed a law. It was clearly, it was kind of generically written, but it's clearly aimed to make it so that people in America cannot use TikTok. And in fact, TikTok is named at some point. And it takes effect at the beginning of the year. And starting around January, users won't be able to update the app or use new versions. Or so eventually, within a few months, you're not really going to use TikTok if the Supreme Court does not reverse the lower courts upholding the law. So the government claims that this is about national security and that because it gives China access to our data and stuff. However, as a lot of people have pointed out, this seems to be a kind of weak justification, especially given that China clearly has all our data. There are all sorts of other ways to get it. And also a lot of the legislators who were in favor of this law gave reasons that had to do much more with suppressing the content of certain viewpoints. They didn't like one of those topics being pro-Palestine speech, but others as well. And under the First Amendment,
it was not to cut you off. It was hardcore. It was, I would say, 98% of their justification was that. They had the charts and everything. If you all remember, they had there was 300 pro-Palestine hashtags to every one. Israel. Pro-Israel hashtag. But go on, sorry.
No. You feel free to interrupt me because this is a lot. Once I start talking about a legal case, I can go on.
No.
And under the First Amendment, the Supreme Court is clear that the worst kind of laws, sort of the most suspicious kind of laws, are those that target certain viewpoints, because the government is not supposed to be deciding what viewpoints get to be heard, what are to be silenced. So because this looks like it might be viewpoint discrimination, that's what it triggers what's known as strict scrutiny, which means the law has to be narrowly tailored to meet a compelling government interest. So I think the core issue facing the Supreme Court will be whether the government can convince the court that this is really needed for reasons of national security. Or, as TikTok argues, and like the ACLU argued in what's known as an amicus brief, a kind of supporting brief, that this is really a way of tamping down on speech that our government doesn't like, namely pro-Palestine speech, and thereby should be struck down.
So real quick, who all wrote amicus briefs in support of TikTok?
So I only read the ACLUs. The ACLUs was signed on to by a number of prestigious institutions, though, First Amendment, like the Knight Institute, which I have a lot of problems with. They're way too they take a lot of liberal positions, and that they sometimes are okay with speech suppression if it's like hate speech.
Right.
But so that was a very good brief and was really less written almost on behalf of TikTok than on behalf of Americans and our First Amendment right to use this
Which, yeah,
platform.
yeah, which I would hope, so
Yeah,
that someone is advocating for Americans. It's not just about corporate power or whatnot. It is, if they can do it to a billion-dollar corporation like that, then your average American has no fighting chance.
right. And like all of these cases pose some interesting questions. And I think in a way the government believes that it can get away with things that it can't because the technology is different from anything we've experienced in the past. So the ACLU's brief drew an analogy. It would basically be like if the government shut down the New York Times. Um,
Okay.
the idea that the government could shut down a
Mhm.
specific newspaper is crazy. Of course, they're going to say, well, this is like a Chinese newspaper that's trying to propagandize Americans
Well,
into things that harm us. Yeah,
but when you really think about it, though, but it's actually not Chinese content. The
yeah,
content itself is all Americans, right? It's
right,
us producing these videos, and so their issue, of course, is they are attacking the algorithm, right? And then how the data is
right,
stored, where it's stored. Of course, this isn't necessarily a new issue. During the Trump administration in 2020, it was a problem. So in order to appease that, the TikTok ByteDance, who ByteDance is the Chinese majority shareholder of TikTok, but TikTok is technically a Singaporean company.
hmm,
But they built all these data centers in Austin, Texas. So our data is not stored, it doesn't
right,
leave the continental US. It is
right,
stored in. So the idea, though, is that, well, because ByteDance owns, ByteDance is a CCP affiliated business. It's out of Beijing. They say, the idea is that because they are a majority shareholder, they could force TikTok to do like a backdoor and
hmm,
apparently, I don't know. I mean, tell the Chinese government how many puppy videos we're all watching. I mean,
yeah.
that's what I said, a long time ago, that if the Chinese invade with puppies and kitten videos, we're screwed because we're done. All right. Like they know what to come at me with. All right.
Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, telling you, they offer me a chance to roll around in the mud with an elephant. It's happening. Okay. Like,
So one of the things that the government argues is that it's not a saving issue is that the law says that instead TikTok can sell it to, I think, that company you just mentioned. Um,
so ByteDance
that
is
can,
the Chinese company that
okay.
that owns the majority, and they're the ones who own the algorithm. But so let's talk about who wants to buy
Yeah.
TikTok.
So what I've heard is it's an Israeli company.
Of course it is, because why wouldn't it be, right? Yeah, yeah. There was a consortium that came together when they first pushed this through, which is really kind of scary if you think about the implications of what this is. So you actually had this kind of old legislation that was sitting around, floating around for years, couldn't get passed. They couldn't get support for it. Then October 7th happens, right? And then you have this massive pushback against Israel's ability and quote unquote right to wage war indiscriminately against 2 million civilians. And so what happens? All of a sudden, the Israeli lobby, the Jewish lobby, and it's not just the Israeli lobby, it is the Jewish lobby as well, kicks into high drive. And all of a sudden, you see power flexed in Washington that is really kind of unfathomable to most people, right? I was thinking about the way that lobbies work the other day, about how most lobbies are kind of like destructive lobbies, right? Bills come to committee, and then they work to kind of water them down, get them, get their exceptions put in, their little caveats put in, right? That's mostly how all lobbying works. But there
Right.
are a handful of lobbies that can actually generate their own legislation, right? And it's really only the banking lobby, the Israeli lobby, and
Yeah.
sometimes the pharmaceutical lobby.
Right.
And 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 we don't see this power get flexed very often, but when it does, it's almost breathtaking in what they are able to accomplish, right? And to be clear, there is no other, there's nothing else like it. You will not find, even when we had the crash. I mean, you saw like the immediate tarp and whatnot, but it took over a year. Actually, I think it was 2 years to get, the Dodd-Frank bill passed. And of course, that was written by bank lobbyists and whatnot. But still, it was a while. So to see this come to fruition in less than 3 months is what they were able to hammer it out.
Yeah.
And to call for the total banning of this company simply because it was criticizing, there was too much criticism of the Israeli government on this platform, is just, it should scare the crap out of every American out there.
It should.
Yeah.
I think one question is whether the court will look at the statements or not, because if it decides to just look at the plain language of the text, I think that would be the wrong result. Obviously, I think this law is clearly unconstitutional. I think it's important to look at the intent. And I think in any event that national security justification is so shoddy that, that should prompt the court to look at what was said about why they're passing this and on all of the legislative history and stuff. But hopefully the court will look at that. And one other thing to note was that in an earlier case this year called Net Choice, that was a case in which Texas and Florida enacted laws saying that the social media platforms could not censor based on viewpoint. Was very controversial. And the argument that the platforms made was that they have First Amendment rights to censor because they sort of curate their platforms. They're like a newspaper. They exercise editorial discretion, and therefore they have the right to like get rid of hate speech or health misinformation or, whatever. And the argument that the states made was that they're just hosts for speech. They're not analogous to newspapers. But the court kicked, it's complicated procedurally. The court kicked the case back basically for more fact finding, but in important part or in pertinent part said the lower courts were mistaken to say that the platforms were more like, were hosts rather than editors, that actually they're like newspapers, so they have a First Amendment right to censor if they want. And so if the court is being consistent, then TikTok also should have a First Amendment right to otherwise they're not really being consistent. Either the platforms are like protected themselves as like newspaper type entities under the First Amendment, or they're not.
Right. So that kind of like goes to 230, right? Which I'm sure you are very, very familiar with. I have no doubt. And I kind of take a lot of issue with 230. I feel like it's good. It's good in idea and whatnot, but I kind of view these social media platforms almost as like utility companies, right? They should be accessible to everyone.
Common carriers, yeah.
Right. And they're just kind of just there to host essentially, and anything as far as like legally goes should be left up to authorities.
So I'm with you, and that was the argument basically that the states had made in favor of their laws. These are like common carriers, which was sort of a doctrine that originated with railroads and then telegraph companies, where courts said you can't, if you are one of these type of entities, you can't like discriminate against people because of the message they're sending or the color of their skin or whatever. You can't kick people off the train because they're black. You can't not send a telegram because you don't like the message. Those are common carriers. People rely on these services. And that was the analogy the states drew. And I was in favor of that. I like personally, so my office took no position on this matter, just to be clear, but I personally was in favor of that. The court rejected it. So I think that if the court it wants to be consistent, and it said, well, these platforms are First Amendment, protected. Basically, they have their own First Amendment right to exist and curate their platforms as they see fit. Then So I'm not arguing based on my personal beliefs about what the court should have found. And then at choice cases, I'm arguing based on what they've found. Well, then to be consistent, they have to.
And so when was that case decided?
June, July, something like that.
Okay, interesting. So, and that was SCOTUS.
Yes, that was so it was up on an emergency appeal, and they basically said more fact finding has to be done to understand exactly. And the laws were very complicated, and they actually didn't say like all of the laws might be problematic. There were some subsections that they were troubled by. And so my case was heard around the same time, and that had to do with the government coercing, pressuring, and working with
Mhm.
social media companies to censor disfavored views. And our argument was that the government can't do that because the government can't censor that speech directly. It can't work through the platforms to accomplish those means. We unfortunately lost based on what's known as standing.
Right. Right.
Basically, the court said you can't, because the platforms had content moderation policies prior to the government getting involved. Maybe your clients would have been censored anyway. You can't show that they were only censored because of the government, so therefore you can't trace your injury to the government. It was kind of, in my opinion, a bullshit dodge.
Yeah.
And the case still goes on in the lower courts because this was an emergency motion. So we're arguing that the standard is much higher and we should still be able to
Mhm.
proceed with the lawsuit. But anyway,
Okay.
that's
Yeah. Yeah. I would think just, they clearly, even if you said that they were clearly taking advantage of manipulating the laws to, or, the company policies in order to serve their purposes, which should be illegal. Like,
of course, they were
you know,
absolutely doing
yeah.
that. And it was, I mean, I think part of what was going on was the court did not want to deal with the massive record in this case. Like, we were up on appeal from a preliminary injunction, which is just an emergency motion.
Hmm.
You don't even normally get discovery, but in this case, the court let us get some, like a limited amount. And it was already a 20,000 page record. And we're basing it off like, lots of emails and exchanges that you really have to look at and understand. This isn't,
Hmm.
that so and so was berating so and so at Meta, and then Meta changed their
Hmm.
policy, and you have to look at the evidence that like they didn't actually want to change their policy, and this just
Right.
requires a lot of reading of documents. And I
Yeah.
think the
Yeah.
court didn't want to go to that trouble, and it
Yeah.
was also like they didn't want to deal with the merits because I think there are some complexities in terms of if it's voluntary, like where do we draw the line? If the platforms want the government to work with them, can they?
Right. Yeah. And I mean, I can understand that to a certain extent, but yeah, that's,
Yeah.
I mean, it's a lot. It is. And, and we can see the dangers, obviously, of, we see how fast things spread on these social media apps. It's incredible. Anybody that's ever had
Yes.
a post go viral, a thread go viral, they know how quickly these things can spread. And you do have to be careful. It is a world in which our founders could have never, and I'm a
A
free
thousand.
speech
Yes. I
absolutist, but I'm also not an idiot. Like, I
Yeah.
understand, and people are hyper emotional and they take things so crazy. So the ability to shut something down, when it is quote unquote potentially dangerous, it's such a hard, a fine needle to thread, because they do have a great responsibility. Even if you have a large platform, you should understand the responsibility that you have to, when you're speaking to hundreds of thousands or even millions of people, and what you're telling them. And we see people, you can just whip them up into a frenzy like it's just nothing, and
Of
it's
course, and some
wild.
people
Yeah.
want to do that, and so I'm
Yeah.
sympathetic to the problem. And like for instance, we saw it
Hmm.
last week with the I mean, there are many instances over I can think of just off the top of my head with the Christmas market shooter. He's
Yep.
Muslim, he's not Muslim, and
Yep.
this was used to whip up a frenzy against Muslims.
Yep.
Or the Amsterdam pogroms,
Yep.
where there were a lot of
40 beheaded babies.
yeah, and
Boom, off,
this caused enormous harm.
Yep.
So I'm sympathetic to the idea there's a problem. I don't think that the solution lies in censorship.
I
It's
agree.
more
Yep.
speech.
Yep.
But I do understand. I mean, there was no way in the 1700s that you could
Could have
sort of
fathomed. Yeah.
yeah, and the speed with which this just spreads throughout the population and can
Right.
actually whip up hate and support for a genocidal war, as we
Right. Right.
saw.
Yeah. I just
Uh,
think about, like my Matt Gates thread, it got 12 million views, in like 3 days. And that was, more than the population of the US at the time,
wow.
that the Constitution was drafted. And so just the idea that
Yeah,
ideas could have spread to literally
I
every single
know.
person in the 13 colonies in like 2 days. It's just something that they couldn't have prepared for. And they were very wise men. I don't know how they would have addressed that,
Yeah,
you
neither
know?
And that's what you try to figure out. I mean, and you mentioned like if your responsibility if you have a reasonably large following. Like I think you and I are, we try to be careful. If we make mistakes, we admit them. Everyone makes
Mhm.
mistakes sometimes. I never want to mislead people. I always try to get the
Right.
facts
Yep.
straight. Of course, like everybody else, sometimes I'd jump to conclusions too quickly and have to correct myself. But there are a lot of bad actors out
Mhm.
there who are just going for engagement.
Yep.
Like we were looking at there was a post. Some guy claimed that he had decorated his house with Christmas lights, and the Muslims across the street were offended, so we put more lights on. And I mean, that struck me as not true. I've just
Right.
never heard of a Muslim being actually offended by Christmas lights. And
Yeah.
Melissa found the
Yeah.
photo, and it was
Yeah.
like from some other completely different thing.
Right,
Um,
Jenin sent it to me. It said like my neighbors, and this guy lived in the UK. And initially, I was like, "There's no way that the house is in the UK," but I was wrong. It was in Scotland. But it was just a house with just like an obscene amount of Christmas lights. I mean, you can see my Christmas lights in the windows behind me. I love Christmas lights, but it was a lot of Christmas lights. But yeah, so I just ran it through an image filter, and what do you know? It was part of a 2021 article about the most decorated houses in the UK. But
yeah.
this was generated to stir up hate against Muslims, and of course the
Yeah.
comments are just full of people
And it got
talking
like
about if they don't, yeah,
210,000 likes or something.
crazy amounts. If they don't like it, they can go back, and it's like the problem, like, again, I don't know. I'm probably aggressive. If somebody came up to me and told me they didn't like my Christmas lights, I would probably not be very nice. I'm gonna be honest with you there. But at the same time, like, I certainly wouldn't just run up to some random person and say, if you don't like my Christmas lights, you can get the out of my country, which
I
is
know.
essentially what was being done there, which is just like, why? Like, why do you have to be like that? But again, why? Because engagement, content is king,
Yeah.
engagement rules the day. And interestingly enough, though, as soon as Jenny sent that to me, it was like 5 minutes, maybe. I
Yeah.
ran it through an image tracker. I went back. I was going to QT the post and say something about it, and it had already been deleted. It was
Yeah.
really, really weird.
Yeah. So someone must have called them out.
Yeah, it must have.
But
But I mean, you're talking about like, I mean, like you said, it had like 200,000 likes. I mean, that's
yeah, I
I
know.
the most likes
It's,
I've ever gotten is like 180,000, and
I haven't even gotten that close.
it
Yeah.
took like it takes a lot. Like, I mean, I've had
Yeah.
many posts reach well over 1 million views. It takes a lot to get 1 million or to get 100,000 likes, like a lot. So to get 200,000 is it's insane. Yeah. January 10th, that means we've got 16 days. So what happens if the Supreme Court sides with the government?
Um, that would be really bad. I
I
think
know.
that it would. I mean, so Congress could basically cite a lot of justifications for getting rid of any social media platform, right? They could say
Right.
Twitter poses a risk to
Right.
safety. And that's a compelling government interest, and we have to ban people from using Twitter.
Right.
So,
Real quick. So one of the provisions of the law, I remember when it was written, was that if 20% or more of the company is owned by a foreign entity deemed
right,
to be an adversary of the U.S., then it would be in violation of this law, right?
right.
And so what was interesting is that like X was bought by Elon Musk and his investors, right? So I think he owns, I forget, I think it's just like 14% or something like that. Don't quote me on that. But it's actually a conglomeration of investors behind him, to include Saudi investors, right?
Huh.
And so that was one thing. And I remember when this was passing that Elon was actually against it. He was like, I don't think this is a good idea. I think there are different ways that we could go about this, yada, yada, yada. But that was one part, was, it was like, look, today it's TikTok, tomorrow it's X.
Yeah.
And so, oh, I feel like we kind of got sidetracked with who wanted to buy TikTok.
Yeah.
But so, yeah, after the government, pushed this law through, then all of a sudden this kind of group of, I'm not even joking, these are like hardcore Zionists, get together, right? It's like Keith Rambois, I think is how you say his name. Reid Hoffman, I believe, was part of it. These are just like hardcore Zionists. And they say, and most of them are Jewish, but not all of them, but most of them were. They say that they want to buy TikTok now. So the idea was that the Israeli government forces this kind of ban,
Right.
and now these Jewish investors, along with some other Christian Zionist investors, come in, and essentially they're going to pick it up on the market, when it's been banned. But of course, they want to buy the algorithm, which ByteDance basically told them to get themselves,
Yeah.
that they were never going to sell the algorithm in the actual. I mean, that's the only thing that's actually worth anything.
Is
The
there
actual.
any precedent for Congress saying, like, we're going to shut this business down unless it gets sold to this other specific entity? I find that very strange.
No, and yeah, and you got to think about like that. Those are just straight up gangster tactics
Yeah,
that they
yeah,
used.
yeah,
And that was what would just like TikTok. I was like, this is, even if you hate TikTok, you have to acknowledge that this is disturbing, the idea that this
yeah.
handful of investors, right, who happen to also run these massive PACs, right, who
Mhm.
give all of this money to all of these politicians, are able to get their lobby to ram this freaking bill through, something that never happens. 3 months is just unheard of in the US
Yeah,
Congress to pass this kind of legislation.
yeah.
Something that would ban one of the biggest corporations in the US. Something, this TikTok is relied upon by 6 million small
Wow.
businesses for 6 million small businesses for advertisements. It generates over $25 billion in revenue for the US economy every year. They've never once demonstrated an actual security risk
Right.
to the people. So, just the idea that they can ram this through it should just scare the crap out of everyone.
It should. It
Yeah.
really is. It really is frightening. But well, we'll keep our eye on this, and maybe we'll talk about it once we hear oral argument
Yeah,
and
yeah. So we've
talk
got
about
like
what the court
15
said. Yeah.
minutes. Yeah, I know. I want to hear what
Yeah.
you think about that, about the oral
I
arguments.
will be fascinated. It happens to be on my birthday, so I can't think of a better thing to do on my birthday than listen to the TikTok case.
Real quick, do you have a favorite justice?
Um, that's a good question. I like Gorsuch a lot.
Okay.
Sometimes I disagree with him, but I think he's pretty consistent, good with free speech. He's good on criminal law. I was a criminal defense attorney for a long time, and like a lot of
Mm-hmm.
conservatives are not good on criminal law. Like
Yeah.
they'll depart from kind of constitutional strictures because they don't like criminals. I find it like he's very principled in that he is very protective of people's rights, even when they're charged with actual crimes. And also like
He's
really good
got a
on
little
free
bit of
speech.
a libertarian streak to him too, doesn't he?
Yes,
Yeah.
yeah. He's probably my favorite. I like Alito. He's good too. How about you?
Oh, Thomas. I'm like
Thomas, yeah. Yeah.
I read Thomas's biography like when I was really young. I was like 23, I think, and
Yeah.
I just adored him after that. And even though
Yeah.
I don't agree, I certainly don't agree with all of his positions, like at
Yeah.
all. Like I actually vehemently disagree with him on some things, but I do like him. I'm super basic like that. But I actually used to kind of like Kennedy a little bit. I used to, I had a soft
Yeah.
spot for him. But of course, Alito. I like people that are like kind of abrasive. So
Yeah.
I like the abrasiveness.
Yeah.
But yeah, and I said Alito. I meant Scalia. Sorry,
Scalia, yeah.
super abrasive.
Yeah. The
But
departed Scalia. Yeah,
yes, yeah.
I really can't stand maybe I shouldn't say this, but Roberts and Kavanaugh I just find so like they're like
Yeah,
conservative, but they're so
smarmy.
weak, and they often just veer to the center. They completely, in my opinion, were so unprincipled on our case, the Murphy versus Missouri.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Oh, I can't stand Kavanaugh. I can't believe, what happened to him. It really did radicalize me. The Kavanaugh,
yeah.
like I could spend all day talking about, I was like a crazy woman when that
Yeah.
hearing was going
Well,
on.
that was like one of my first big breaks with the left, because I was like, first of all, I worked in a public defender office, and they
Yeah.
were all like, wanted him to not get confirmed, and were like crying during the hearings because it was so traumatizing to them that he could possibly even be confirmed. And I was like, wait a second, we're always like, what? This is something he was a very nebulous thing he was accused of doing like a really long time ago when he
Right.
was a teenager and nobody even quite remembers and like whatever. Even if he did it, like first of all, we're supposed to be like for redemption and things you do as a
Right.
teenager, like you don't have to pay for them for the
Yeah.
rest of your life. And also like I don't like the evidence was so sketchy. Like I would never
It
it
didn't,
was
as far as I'm concerned, it didn't exist. Yeah, I had just
yeah.
left the office that I had worked in as a paralegal for a criminal defense attorney, and having seen indigent clients just get railroaded, and I just
Yeah.
thought, the precedent that you are setting right now, and I'm sorry, but there actually are a lot of women out there with a lot of vendettas.
Yeah.
Okay, and I have personally seen them railroad men left and right, and if you actually care about innocent people not being accused and charged of crimes, you certainly don't want to lower the standard
No.
by which we assess evidence and testimony, and giving credence to 30-year-old testimony when you can't, when no one can corroborate it. You can't give it any specifics whatsoever. You have these vague notions. You don't actually even know specifically which house you were in, you know
Right.
I mean, it's just preposterous, the whole
Yeah.
thing, the beginning to end. And I was like, at the end of the day, the only people that are really going to pay is going to be poor people.
Yeah.
All right, when stuff like this, testimony like this, is given credence in a court of law. And you guys, I don't know, but they just don't care. So I
No.
so
I
I
mean,
just
so the argument I got when I made that was like, well, it's not a court of law. This is like about he doesn't have a right to become a Supreme Court justice. And I'm like, yeah, but people don't think along those kind of technical lines. Like once we
correct.
accept this, and like frankly, if he did it, I don't think that disqualifies him
No.
as a nominee for the Supreme Court. Like to me, it's like, okay, like he did something not great.
Really
Like if he
shitty
did
as a
it
teenager.
as a
Yeah.
teenager, like this is what 30 years later, like it's
Right.
not reflective on his ability to be a Supreme Court justice anyway. That
Right.
was one of the first things that made me kind of start to be like, I don't know if I really belong on the left because I was met with
Yeah.
so much hostility when I made those points.
Oh yeah,
So,
yeah. I mean, I was just like an unhinged like lunatic when I was so angry. I just remember I was upstairs in my room just like watching it on. I couldn't even like leave the room. Like I was just like yelling at the TV, like, how is this happening right now? And the thing I hated most was I hated Kavanaugh. I didn't even like him. I was
I
like,
mean,
you're
he's
like making me like defend this man when his, everything about him I hate.
yeah,
Okay.
and he's been, I mean, a huge
He's just
disappointment on
been
the court, but
super disappointment. Yeah.
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 Well, all right. So that is our
Yeah.
discussion on the
Yeah.
Supreme
So,
Court and TikTok. We'll
yeah.
keep you posted.